G'day everyone. Hey, welcome to Restore Native webinar on all the things you need to know about starting a planting project. So thanks everyone for coming along. You probably won't see a lot of me out here on the edge of your screen depending on where you're at, but a few little housekeeping things. If you're on your phone, just tilt that on the side and you'll be able to see the presentation best. So we're going to be running through a few slides. If you want to ask a question, and fully encourage you to do so, click the Q&A button. So down the bottom, you'll see a Q&A button. And basically, if you type your question in there, we'll drag that out and hopefully we can cover it as we go through each step of the process. But at the end, I'll hang around and we'll answer a bunch of questions for you at that stage as well. So yeah, by all means, be interactive. For any of those who know me already, you know that I talk a bit fast and get a little bit excited about trees at times. So if I'm not covering it in enough detail or there's things we've missed, then by all means, just sing out. So that's all good. Yeah, if you're on a phone, landscape will see it best. That's fine. I think I mentioned that. And really, the purpose of this tonight is about covering off a lot of the sort of overall broad stroke. We're going to touch on a lot of things in terms of the planning, grades of plants, spraying and a few things like that. But there's a lot more detail we'll be able to dive into on the specific topics. And we will at time, I think over the rest of the year, sort of dive deep on some of the things like plant grades, like plant releasing, some of those things. But tonight we're going to sort of cover everything. Fire your questions at me, and then we'll have a bit of a run through from there. Oh, questions in already? Yeah, cool. Okay, no worries at all. I'm just getting a little bit of technical information here. So Amy is running the webinar for us. She'll be clicking us through. So if you hear me go, hey, Amy, something's not quite wrong, right? She'll be sorting it, and Claire's helping out a bit some of the questions too. So there are some videos in the presentation. So you'll just need your sound on and you'll be able to hear them. If they don't quite play right, I know coverage isn't perfect for everyone. We've got those all on our YouTube channel on YouTube. If you just type Restore Native NZ, you'll be able to find us there. So cool, we'll kick off and we'll get underway. Cool, this is me and my pink shorts, which are not pink tonight, they're actually orange, which you can only just see, but everyone who knows me will know don't take that too seriously, and my fashion advice isn't probably my strong point. But so for those of you who don't know me, I started Restore Native about 6 or 7 years ago. Oh, what are we, 6 years ago officially. Have been growing things all my life, so very passionate about growing things. My parents were dairy farmers, their parents were horticulturalists, and then they're viticulturalists back from there. So growing things has always been in our blood. And I own a farm here in Cambridge, just a dry stock farm around about 100 hectares, and that's where the nursery is based. So yeah, Waikato boy, so farming as well. So I'm a beef farmer, and yeah, that's probably keeps me out of trouble when I'm not growing trees. Big into conservation, so real big passion for the bush and restoring that. And I think as sort of when I was younger, got into appreciating birds and hiking and hunting and those sorts of things, and just sort of understanding the bush flow a bit more. So we do a lot of trapping and stuff as well at home, also involved in some other projects, and we've got a community project launching later in the year that Restore Native's right behind as well. And yeah, my goals is a really interesting one. The number one thing for me is breaking down barriers to get trees in on farms. So that's the number one purpose of Restore Native, really. It's farmers are 40% of New Zealand's land is farmed. And if we can make it easier for farmers to get trees planted and to do that right thing environmentally, farmers will do it. And we want to be an important part of that process. So we'll roll on to the next slide. Cool. So this is a little bit of a video, and that'll just explain a little bit more, hopefully a bit more articulate than what I was just saying there. Welcome to Restore Native. I'm Adam Thompson, and we'd like you to join our vision for restoring unproductive farmland in New Zealand to beautiful, diverse native forest. We're doing that by offering really high quality, reasonably priced native trees. We start from advice, we can supply trees, but we can also offer planting, maintenance, and everything you need to grow beautiful native forest on your land. So if you're passionate about getting the right balance between biodiversity and productive farming on your land, then we should talk. And that's pretty much it, guys. That's as simple as it is for us. Balancing biodiversity and farming. So that's what we'll get on with the role I'm talking about. I've already got a couple of questions through, so I'll just answer those very quickly. Yes, we will send out a recorded version of this, so anyone who registered for the webinar will get a recorded version, so that's no worries at all. Yep, we'll keep on rolling, so it's all good. There'll be some more here. We'll keep going. Cool. Amy will pop us on to the next slide. So who are we? So we're based in Cambridge. So we're a native plant nursery growing about 1 million plants. We specialise in revegetation. So that's sort of first taking over that process from planning through planting and maintenance to get a native forest sort of established, whether that's riparian or revegetation planting. We send plants out all over the North Island, so we actually ship plants as far as Wellington, the Wairarapa, and up north at times as well. But we offer planting maintenance services across the Greater Waikato and to Bay of Plenty as well. So our big key thing is, it's by farmers for farmers. Like I say, like the farmer motivation is a big one for us, being a farmer myself. And our saying there, trees for the land, the birds and the people. I think the more and more I do this, you see it's the people, the intergenerational connections to the land, those things that matter in terms of these processes. So right tree in the right place, that's important. There's a place for pine trees in our country, but it's not all over wholesale on dry stock land. And hey, we've got an awesome team here, 12 full-time staff in our team, balancing between nursery and on-site work as well as casual. So we swell to about 25 in our busy season. So awesome bunch of people, just passionate about what we do. So cool, that's enough about us. Let's talk about what we're going to cover tonight. So we're basically going to run through the whole process in terms of what does it look like, starting out from I've got a bit of farmland to I've got a wonderful diverse native bush that's thriving and providing that biodiversity and all the other benefits. So we'll start off with site identification, run through planning, preparation and weed control, your pre-spray, your site prep, the supply itself and the planting techniques. And then we get into releases and maintenance, and then enrichment, planting, final checks, pest control, those sorts of things. So try and keep it as simple as possible, run through those 7 steps tonight in a little bit more detail, and then we can drill down onto each one of them as we wish. Cool, site identification. So hopefully those photos are big enough. If you're on a phone, they might be a little bit smaller, but here's the 3 sort of really good examples of the type of sites that will be out there planting on any given day in the Waikato. So the top one, you can see there's a river there in the foreground, and that floods at times. It floods into that back area where that big tree is, and you can see there's sort of areas there that have been underwater in the winter. And it was just an area that wasn't productive for cattle and actually horse grazing on this property as well. So basically, the landowner identified that. We went and worked out exactly where we're going to wind up putting the fence to balance that grazing pasture, as well as having a nice native area in there. And then we chose the right species basically to get, a good wetland mix in there, but take that area out of grazing. Not actually going to lose a lot of productivity. Out to the left of that, there's actually some good grassland. And then there's a beautiful wetland growing in there now, which is absolutely fantastic. So we'll get some updated photos in coming years on that one as well. The next one, and it's blocked me out a little bit, but actually go back a slide there, Amy, sorry. So the second photo there, it's a really steep hill directly in the foreground, but then you can see there's big flats out in the background, and this is classic river terraces on the Waikato River. And it's that really steep grazing. This is not a dairy farm. It's just not productive. So it self-identifies in terms of that sense. And then the bottom one there, there's a duck pond. And on the other side of it, there was actually just a single wire fence that's been put in quite close to the pond. And the farmer noticed that the cattle are actually camping down close under there. And there's a tree on the left-hand side and starting to erode that bank. So in terms of the reasons that you're going to be planting, for all of us proud about our farm, there's going to be that beautification thing. Water quality is really paramount in 2 of these here, where nutrient could be leaching into those areas. So identifying those areas on your farm, some of them are really obvious, but it's looking at these things. And then it's like, where are we going to put the fence? Some of them self-select. But like the bottom one, for example, the decision's been made to actually shift that fence to the top of that hill. because it's sort of the back end of a paddock. It's hard for getting cows out of. They're doing damage to that hill, and the farmer's gone, hey, it's actually not much land. It's only going to be about 0.1 of a hectare in the end. And that's going to basically stop that erosion and that sediment and nutrient loss down into that pond. And then ultimately, biodiversity is another reason, right? So the middle one there, Waikato River Terraces, not far from Maungatautari. As we stood there, we were watching tui fly around and we're going, cool, we can actually contribute to that biodiversity of the landscape. So identifying site is the number one thing to do. Here are three sort of, random examples, but sort of everyone out in terms of having a look at a farm, when I go out to farms with farmers, we'll have a look around and it'll kind of be like, well, how are we going to approach that area, Adam? You got to factor in things like stock movement. You don't want to take out a heap of good grazing just to catch that little bit of an area that's not right. So that's where we sort of work through going, cool, how can we make this work right and actually make it fit into the farm system as well? So we'll go on to the next one. So planning. So drone mapping. So we're really big on making sure that you know what you're getting and actually quantifying that beforehand. So it's not looking at a hill and sort of going, oh yeah, a few hundred plants will take care of that. We also find that although Google Earth can be handy for getting an idea of an area, where you've put in new fences or you want to get a bit more drilled into the detail, a drone mapping really helps. And drone mapping also picks up the total surface area. So if you've got steep land, Google Earth isn't quite going to actually get a correct measurement for you there. So that's why we think the drone mapping is good. We'll cover that off in a little bit more. And then that planning is sort of, it's the right tree, right place thing. It's the species mix. So it's about, this particular one we're looking at in that little picture. It's coastal, it's really exposed to salt winds and a lot of things like that it's quite harsh. And we ended up planting a Manuka-Kānuka dominated mix that actually had a lot of tōtara in it as well. So it was sort of hardy plants selected right for that site. But that's not the right thing for a riparian strip on flat land at Matamata, for example. So it's all different in that sense. In that planning space, plant density is really important. So spacing is one of the most important things that's going to determine, how quickly you can close a canopy and actually get a forest happening. What is the right spacing? Yeah, and that's a very religious question. Some people insist it must be this or it must be that, or this is fine. But each site is different, relatively bony hillside in that example there, coastal, unfertile land. We spaced those out a little over 2 meters in the end. So it was round about low 2000s plants per hectare. That will close a canopy, but it's going to be more like 8 or 10 years before those trees are actually big enough that they're touching and actually creating a canopy. So there's quite a bit of weed control to be done in that time. Where you're sort of really visual areas or real high fertility or real high weed burden, we're coming as close as 1.5 meters. And that's sort of the gold standard. If you plant at 1.5 meter centers, you can get canopy closure in about 3 years. So the weed burden is low, the plant survivability is higher, and you can go with more diversity in terms of your species as well, because you don't need really hardy species because they're actually going to be protecting each other. So each site dictates a different sort of approach to it, but budget's a big one as well. Obviously more trees, more cost, and you got to make sure you're spending that money wisely. And that's why, we like to adapt every site to the requirements. Plant sizing, we're going to talk a bit more about that later. But obviously some species are hardier than others. So your things like Manuka and Kānuka, you can put in smaller grades and they will survive. But there are less hardy species and you just can't spread them out, or you have to put them in a little bit bigger because they're slower growing. So we'll talk through that, cover that off a bit more later. Co-funding. So in that planning stage, funding is a really important part of it too. So we'll cover that off in a bit more detail. But working with your council and other funders is a key part of that planning process, because if there's funding for your catchment, and depending on what that funding is, could dictate what you actually decide to plant. So let's go through this in a bit more detail. Cool, drone mapping. There's a little bit of a video here, and then I'll just talk to the map on the side. So that plays through fine. G'day team, Adam here from Restore Native. Got my drone with me here today. Trusty tool for us in the field when we're planning projects. So why a drone? Well, it's all about mapping and getting accurate data so that when we're sharing that information with you about how many trees you're going to need,
and the area that you've got, you know exactly that you've got the right amount of trees and you've got the right trees going in the right place. So I can come out, we can send it up, map the area for you, and you know you're getting an accurate measurement on your planting area.
So yeah, the drone's become a really handy tool in my toolkit for planning. And for any of my clients who are on here at the moment who would have seen this box on the right-hand side, that blue line is basically us drawing around an area that's to be planted. And so by mapping around that on our mapping software that we use with the drone, we can give an exact area to that, and then we can say, hey, cool, if you're going to space plants in there at 1.5 meter spacings, 2 meter spacings, well, whatever it is, we can guarantee that the right number of trees are going to go in there. So we're not going to get to the end and run out of plants, and we're not going to get to the end and go, we've got too many plants, we'll pack them in really tight. It's about actually spreading it out properly across the area. So planning, in that planning phase, getting that map right is a really good place to start. So now, the next thing is right tree, right place. This is a really cool diagram. Some of you may have seen it before, but it's just a really simple way of orchestrating, of demonstrating exactly what is meant to be planted in the different areas. So, you know, farmland on one side, you can have pasture zone, cool trees and shrubs. So if this is a riparian area, it's all happening quite quickly. But you can have some trees and shrubs. You might have some manukas and pittosporums, and then you go down a little bit. You can have some cabbage trees as it gets a little bit wetter. And then you're going to come into, you know, wetland grasses and stuff like that alongside a creek. So that's a really quick way of showing it. But this happens over a wider landscape too. You know, you go from big steep dry hills where it's, you know, manuka, kanuka, aki, stuff like that. And you come into wetland areas where it's, you know, swamp fixes and toys and kakatea and those sorts of things. So it's important that when an area is planted, the trees actually get distributed right. And anyone in my team will tell you that's one thing I'm really big on when we get out there planting, is that we are actually distributing the trees correctly. I hate seeing swamp flaxes on the side of hills, or, you know, it's just not the right way that they naturally grow. So we need to make sure we're actually giving the tree a chance to thrive by getting everything, you know, allocated into its site well. So selecting the right species beforehand, and that is a specific mix to the site, and then distributing them through the site properly so that they're actually going to create a natural environment. It's really important as well. So this is just a little bit of an overview on how a forest grows. You know, we haven't covered everything in these lists, but it's sort of a general basic example. And the picture there is a project we did at Maungatautari. So this is northern sites of Maungatautari. Now this gully has planting now that's about, I'll be coming up 3 years this year. And you can see those trees are nearly touching there. So they're in at 1.5 meter densities. And the trees on the side are basically colonising that from what was quite rough, steep farmland. And now is basically reverting it to bush. So they're all hardy things, you know, they are the manukas, kanukas, pittosporums. You know, you got fruiting shrubs, karamus, mahoes, stuff like that in there. And the reason that they go in first is because they're hardy, they're fast growing, they can deal with that exposure. And that's their job, is to be colonising. So we call them colonising a pioneer species. And they're going in there. Now, as they create that cover and they create a little bit more space above, enriching that area with long-lived species. So as you look up where this photo is taken with the drone, directly behind it is the Maungatautari Sanctuary Mountain. You got beautiful tawa, kakatea, rewa, you know, there's rimu and miro and all manner of things inside that fence. And that they can't just be thrown out there and sort of put out right at the start, because they are used to actually growing in a two-tier system in a forest. So the pioneering species start, and then these other species come through. So I was the same way 10 years ago, and I was just like, I want to rimu forest, like, you know, plant me some rimus. But you put them out on a dry, exposed hill face, they're going to get absolutely smashed and they're going to drop dead. But by creating a canopy and then planting those plants, they'll come up through and thrive. Obviously, the birds will do their job in time too. And when you've got a beautiful seed source like you do here at Maungatautari, you know, the fruiting species in the pioneering mix, the birds will be transferring seeds to and fro. And that's important to understand what kind of fruits at the same time as other things and what's in the area, which is going to create that really long-term, when we're thinking about a 50, 100 years and beyond, as we are with these plantings, it'll be here long after we're gone. So that's a very quick overview of that, and we can dive a bit deeper on it later. But yeah, we'll kick into the next thing. Oh, actually, I love this. There's a question just come through saying, how do you determine that the plants are right for the area you're planting in? I think across the landscape of the planting area itself, it's really about following that. There'll be drier areas, there'll be damper areas, there'll be stream margins perhaps. And so there are some species which live well in each of them. So in planning the project, we can sort of go, cool, what is naturally occurring in these areas and give advice around that. So whether that's for me doing it on site when I'm actually out there with someone planning that, or I often do it over email. Someone will send me a video or some photos of an area and I'll go, oh, great, along here you can have dry species mix, you can have these 3 or 4 species. Down in here it'll be a bit more diverse. If it's frost prone, you want to keep these ones here out of the frost zone. So we sort of go through and select like that when we're doing our planting on our team, but we can also give advice to that as well. So on the species, another one, what's the fastest growing pioneering species? It does depend a little bit on the area, the soil type, what its exposure is, but it's very hard to go past something like Manuka. Hardy, fast, can tolerate wet, dry, and it tends to be one of the best growers. But if you're in a slightly damper wetland area, something like a ribbonwood just absolutely goes nuts. Wineberry grows really fast in those areas too, where there's a bit more fertility. So yeah, it's about getting a little bit of a balance, but it depends on the site a little bit to actually which one's best. And another one just come through on plants. We eco-sourcing. Yeah, so we do. There are some things which are more important to eco-source than others, in my personal opinion, and this becomes a very religious debate for some people trained in ecology have very opposing views on that. But obviously there are things out there like pittosporums and manukas and that are sold at every garden centre around the country and a different, from a different area, sitting in a backyard, cross-pollinating, and so it's hard to get those true specimen. But we actually collect our seed all around the Waikato, and we select for hardy species, like hardy examples of those species. So where we've had some projects out on the West Coast, we've kind of collected seed from out on the West Coast to make sure we're actually getting really good local seed out there. But with things like Kahikatea and those long-lived species, it's actually really important to get a bit more eco-sourcing. But at the end of the day, a tree planted is better than a tree not planted. And often people will blame eco-sourcing for things not going well, but it's actually more site prep and maintenance that can be a bit of a problem. So yeah, there's no single right answer about that, but where we can, we try and identify really good, hardy, good examples. So, another one on plants, windy areas. Yeah, again, Manuka and Kānuka are pretty hard to beat in really windy areas. But also with really windy areas, like plant density becomes a factor. The sort of wider the spacings, the more each individual tree is exposed. So you really need to have hardy trees. So, hard stem trees like Manuka and Kānuka often go really well in those areas. Strong growers like pittosporums and that as well. Whereas something like a karamu, which is a really important species in terms of its fruiting and the other things it brings to the environment, it's really soft stem and it tends to fall over, so it's not very good in those areas. So yeah, it's a little bit site dependent, but often you'll find the likes of Manuka and Kānuka are good. So I won't play this video on plant density because we've actually covered the whole thing off. Actually we'll play it, Amy, because it's only a short one. And this will just say a little bit more about the growth in this particular spacing. So.
Hey team, Adam here from Restore Native, out in some more mature plantings, and today talking about plant density. You'll hear me talking a lot about plant density when we're planning a project, making sure we're getting spacings right for our trees. And the reason is that you want to get those plants to a point where they're closing a canopy, they're growing together, they're not exposed to the elements, and they're growing well. So what we've got just here in front of me is a lemonwood and a wineberry. We're planted here at about 1.5 metre spacings. They're about 3 or 4 years old now, and they're coming in towards touching each other. This is just providing an excellent result in terms of perfect sort of revegetation. We've got diversity with them there. They're looking after each other nice and tight. If they'd been spread out more to 2.5 metres, they'd be a lot smaller because they'd be a lot more exposed. And they'd also, be looking a lot more time before they're going to close up. And that's where we get issues with things like weeds, blackberry and stuff coming in between these. Down in front of me is a tea talkie here that we put in sort of 12 months ago. Now that's going to come up now. It's got the shade and shelter around it, and it's going to come up through this sort of canopy in this forest. So this is a perfect plan executed in terms of spacing, and now we're providing this big lush native forest, beautiful big aki behind me. Things are growing really well, and that's exactly what we want. So if you want to plan well, right species, execute it well, this is exactly what you want in terms of your revegetation project.
Yeah, he articulated it better there, actually, didn't he? And I've just had a really cool question come through here. What about coastal areas and sea spray? It's looking at the species that thrive in that area. And if you look at, I talk about the Manuka and Kānuka, and I keep going back to it for those hardy areas. They're a woody stem, thin leaf, quite a waxy leaf, so that they take that sort of pounding from the wind and stuff quite well. So that's a good selection for that type of area. Whereas in that video, you saw me sort of wineberry and pittosporums. Well, some of those pittosporums are quite hardy, but some of the softer leaf ones will just get smashed by the wind and the sea spray. So we can certainly recommend those sorts of things for those areas, but every area is a little bit specific. So cool, on to the next. Now, plant size and grade. I talked about eco-sourcing being a bit religious. Plant sizing is a very, very hot topic, and some people defend their plant sizes vehemently. So, look, to be honest, every single one of those grades that are listed there on the right-hand side have their place. And it's just a case of matching a budget and the goals of a project to the right size plant. I'll never say, hey, this is the size that you must have, and it's 100% right. But yeah, it's good to get a bit of an idea. Now, this is a slightly longer video. It's a couple of minutes. I ramble on a little bit here, and I'm going to talk about 40 cell size, 28 cell size, and 1 litre size. And that just gives you a good example of sort of small, medium, big. These are the three main sizes that we grow in. We don't grow in a real small root trainer or a T50. We just don't feel like there's quite bang for buck in most examples. We occasionally will plant a T50 or a forestry grade root trainer on a project, but we'll actually buy those in because there's generally not a lot of projects where we don't feel like the little bit more investment in a 40 cell is actually a really good value. Because the difference between, say, a 50 cell tray has got 100 mils of root ball in it, and a 40 cell has got about 230 odd mils of root ball in it. So there's actually a lot more horsepower under those plants. But you don't need to go and plant really big trees as well, because you can spend a heap of labour planting a really big tree. We can often get quite slow, sluggish trees that have just been nurtured in a nursery for too long, and a planter bag where the roots are all coiled up. And they go in and they get real bad transplant shock, and they don't quite take off in the same way. So it's about balancing that sort of aggressive growth pattern with the root size, and not having too overgrown plants for the size that they are, because they'll just tip over as well. So we actually trim a lot of our plants in the nursery to keep them into a certain height. And just make sure that they're aggressive when they go out. So let's watch this video. It's a couple of minutes, and then I'll be back to discuss that in a bit more detail. There'll be plenty of questions on this one, I'm sure. Feel free to fire them through.
G'day team, Adam here from Restore Native in the nursery today, and I'm talking about the different grades and sizes that we have our plants in, so you can get a bit of an understanding of the size of things and also why we grow them in that size. So we've got here next to me is Kānuka in a 40 cell grade. Now it's toward the end of the season, so this is a little bit taller than it normally is. We normally trim them off around that sort of 400 to 500 millimeters. That means that you've got a really good ratio. You can see the strong root development in here, and there's still strong growth up on top. Now a plant like Kānuka and those really hardy, fast growing species, they actually grow quite well in a 40 cell. That's absolutely fine, but some of the slower growing trees, we need to grow them in bigger grades. But you see the important thing is that strong roots, you can see new roots developing in here. They're all heading down, groove towards the bottom. They're growing well. We've got strong growth on top. You don't want to have too much growth on top, otherwise you've got a small engine driving a big car, and we know that's pretty slow and it's not going to go so well. So that's a 40 cell. That's a really great option for a low-cost way of establishing hardy species. So we predominantly do this in Manuka and Kānuka. We do it in some other species that are hardy, but the important thing with 40 cell is that they need to be hardy, fast-growing, and well-developed. So that's the 40 cell. Now we're going to bring in here a 28 cell. So this is a standard revegetation plant and pretty industry standard. We do a lot of council contracts, and we do them in these 28 cell grades. So again, Manuka here, really well root developed down here, all growing towards the bottom. about 600 millimetres on top. You can see that they've had a little bit of a trim and we're keeping them nice and tidy. They're not a pretty plant, but they're hardy as anything and they grow really well. This 28 cell suits most species in that revegetation and riparian planting, and they're nice and hardy. They grow really well. Again, root development is key and keeping that top in the right size. Now, we do grow a larger grade. And what I've got here today is some tea talkie. You have to forgive me, I've sort of bent it a little bit over and she's a little bit windy. But a tea talkie here in a 1 litre grade, it's a tray of 10. Again, you can see nice root development in here. You see fresh roots coming through, which is great. A nice big tall tree, that's sort of 800 or a metre tall. And the reason we grow things like tea talkie, torquetia, kahikatea, and 10 cells is it gives them a little bit more horsepower down here, a couple of extra years growth in the nursery, big strong trunk through here, and they just need a little bit more weight under them because they're not as fast growing and they're not as hardy. So selecting the right grade of tree is important. We grow things like the Manuka and Karnuka and other species through into this 10 cell as well, which is an option. If you want really hardy trees, you've got a difficult site, then that's good. But for the most case, a 28 cell is good for revegetation. And for your longer live, you're looking at these 10 cell and these more special trees like that. But of course, every site's different, every budget's different. If you want to have a chat about what suits for you, get in touch.
Yeah, I think just worthwhile seeing those in the flesh a little bit. And it really does come down to the budget and a bit of preference on that. And I think broadly that sort of talks to the idea that you can put bigger grades in, and there's definitely merit for the slow-going trees in bigger grades. But there's also, I don't think it's money well spent to go and put in PB5s of Manuka that are this tall when they're really hardy trees that if they go on smaller, they're going to live well. So yeah, we are not linked to one particular size all the time. We merely just, identify the site and the budget and try and find the best thing for it, really. So that's plant sizing. Co-funding. Now, this is a really key thing and a real key part of that planning process. So regional council is the best place to start, no matter where you are in the country. Most regional councils are really engaged. They have different mechanisms or ways of sort of dealing, but generally most councils will have some sort of catchment management department. And in the Waikato here, we've actually got really awesome catchment management officers who look after different areas and help with funding. Now, a big bugbear of mine personally, and I'm sure of the people at the council as well, is that some of that funding's not that consistent year to year. So it's a little bit hard to know, when you're making a 5 or 10 year plan on your farm, exactly what's going to be funded and when it's going to be funded. But the catchment management officers are really good at sort of helping you connect, your project with funding that is available. Now, we're happy to put you, we've got really good relationships with a lot of people at council, and we're happy to put you in touch with the catchment management officer for your area, especially if we're doing a bit of a plan in terms of planting. If we're mapping out an area and you kind of show up at council with a little bit of a plan, that helps your situation as well, in terms of making it easy for them to be able to fit that into their funding options. The other ones I've listed there are things that you apply for funding for. So there are some funders. WSEAT is one of the bigger ones that fund various projects across the Waikato. You can apply for those funders through online, and we've got the contact details for that. And we're certainly happy to help doing that. Waikato River Authority is a big funder, up to $6 million a year going into the Waikato River catchment for planting and other enhancement projects for natives. So it's a contestable fund, and they've all got different rules obviously around them, but we can help with that as well. If you're in South Waikato, the SWE fund is actually really great. They're just really proactive, a good way of getting it out there. The Hill Country Erosion Fund, which is generally administered by the regional councils, and that helps for sort of retiring large areas of hill country. Trees That Count. So you just go onto the Trees That Count website. They've got a local rep who's a really helpful guy as well, and actually reps all over the country. And we can help with your application for them as well. And the other one's dairy companies and processors. If you're a dairy farmer, there seems to be a lot of overseas money coming in. We've got Fonterra, Open Country, OFI, all looking to put some money toward helping their farmers to actually get more trees in on farm. So, and you don't just have to have one of these funders, if the council can chip in a little bit, but perhaps your dairy company can as well. And we are more than happy to help, coordinating that, putting you in touch with the right people, getting a plan together, helping you to write applications, whatever's needed. but take advantage of that funding, because if you can stretch your dollar to help your project go a little bit further, or be a little bit higher quality, then you're not going to regret it. And if that money's out there, then we might as well take it. So yeah, like I say, we can help writing applications. Providing data is really key. So like I say, the drone mapping, planning, if we can actually get you away to these people having this conversation, you've already got a bit of plan behind you. It sort of greases the wheels of progress a bit. We've got relationships with a lot of these people where we can actually, we understand when funding comes available. Occasionally projects can tip over late in the season and they're looking for someone to replace it. And so we can sort of help to connect you in that space. And we can obviously help with the project management side of it too, sort of in terms of our full service. So yeah, co-funding a really important part of the planning process. Site prep and weed control. Now, I actually had a really good question here about blackberry. Will it die out eventually once the canopy starts to thicken up? The birds keep reseeding it. Yeah, blackberry is a real pest, and I know our farm attracts a fair bit of blackberry. It was really good growing that when we came here, and hard to get on top of. The key thing is, before you start planting trees, control the weeds. So a couple of pictures there. One is convolvulus growing all over a bunch of stuff, and that's a bloody dirty creeping vine, which is a problem. And the other is blackberry there. We have things like privet and pampas and various other things. They are so much easier to control these weeds when you're still grazing these areas. Brush killer, repeated applications of brush killer timed right will get on top of these things if you keep on them. But the problem is, you go and plant trees around where you've got these sort of weed burdens, all of a sudden your chemical controls are out the gate, because you no longer can go and spray brush killer in there because you'll kill the trees. So it's a challenge. This question about blackberry dying out eventually once the canopy closes, yes, so it will. The problem is often it's like we're racing for that light. We see areas where trees are being planted in too wide, and this is probably the most common problem we have, is the spacing's too wide. And natives aren't like a pine tree. They can't just sort of keep growing fast with that competition. They actually need to be packed in a bit closer to their mates. If you get the density right, you get the prep right before planting, that canopy is likely to close quicker and your blackberry burden's going to be less. And if you've got the right species in there, you need things that are going to continue to grow and actually shade out. So it's a really good question. Every site's a little bit different, but yeah, density and the right species that will eventually are going to grow big enough to close it out. In most cases, the natives will win. It's just how long is it going to take? So, cool. Site prep methods for you. So depending on your farm, it's like, cool, are you actually just going to give that place a really good hard graze, a quick spray, and you're away? Or what other prep are you going to need to do for your site? Is there some earthworks to be done in an area? So you're not, because obviously once it's covered in trees, you're not going to be able to get in there and clean things out in future. Those things are important to consider. Fencing and timing. So, often, fencing off a rough part of a paddock is actually going to make it easier to manage, but timing that, obviously, to get the fencing done before it gets too wet and whatnot. So a project is sometimes able, it's ready to go and you can just click straight into it, but at other times it can actually take quite a while. So that's an issue. A couple of questions here around weeds. Woolly nightshade. Yeah, woolly nightshade's a real problem because it's spread by birds. They love the berries on it, and that's a challenge. And it will actually grow up through shade in some spaces too, which is a real problem. There's no simple solution for it, but to get onto it early. In situations where you've actually closed the canopy, often the woolly nightshade won't climb up and push through the canopy, but if it can get it some light, it will push through the canopy. We're seeing actually quite a big problem out on the West Coast at the moment in a lot of places. If we can deal with anything that's pre-existing and other areas on the farm, so the seed bank isn't so close, that really helps. Otherwise, getting in there, cutting it, placing the stumps, getting on top of that control, but it can be a big job in big areas. So again, density and good canopy trees are important. Is there anything else here for this? Do we work with alternatives to Roundup? Yeah, that's a good one in terms of pest control and site prep and whatnot. Look, it's hard to beat glyphosate and for what it does, especially for site prep. And we'll click to the next slide because we can talk a bit more about that. So yeah, what you see there in that picture is a hillside that's had glyphosate applied to it in spots. We haven't worked specifically with no Roundup at all and using a different chemical. We've gone with just a hard pre-graze and putting plants in and not spraying it at all. We sort of, we've done a lot of trials on our own farm in terms of just like, hey, how can we save costs out of this to make it more affordable for a farmer to do it? You know, do they have to do a pre-spray? We've had areas where we've grazed it hard, put trees straight in. Things like Manuka, Carnifera in places can deal with that if it's not a really fertile area, and you don't need to spray it at all in some situations. But most species just can't deal with the competition, so some of the control needs to happen. We've used wool itself. We've used woolen mats around things, and we love that sort of, you know, farm connection on that front. But it is hard to beat a well-timed spray and the right chemical. So, yeah, alternatives to Roundup. We're always keen to try things, but at this stage, it certainly seems to be the best option there. Cool. What do we use for sprays? This is a really good one. So what we've got there with the pre-spray, we'll say when to spot spray. You really want to spot spray as close to planting as is practical. You obviously want the spots are going to identify where the trees are going to go. So they need to be showing up by the time you go to plant, so you can get your spacing right. And sometimes it's as simple as, you know, you spray them in a line, walk 2 meters, spray another one. But, you know, an example like that of achieving that sort of coverage, that's probably a month or 6 weeks before planting. And as we know with glyphosate, it's sort of more effective when the plant's growing, so it can be a little bit slower in winter. We actually spray our spot sprays with a mix of glyphosate and Terb. So Terb's the active, glyphosate and Terb are the active, so the product names are very varying different product names. Tag is actually a thing you can spot spray with, which has a similar chemical mix in it. So that gives a combination of sort of initial knockdown to kill what's there and create that space for the tree. And then the Terb's going to have a long acting, so it's not going to have grass rushing back through it straight away in the spring. So really worthwhile doing and spending that little bit of extra money to have that long acting herbicide in there, because it just gives you so much more flexibility in the spring in terms of the timing of your release spray. And that's ultimately why we are spot spraying. We're spot spraying to create a little zone so that tree can go in and have a safe little home where it's not getting out competed from all the grasses and stuff. And, you know, we want to keep that for as long as possible. So that's important. How big should a spot be? So this is a matter of debate, and we've been in trouble before with the council for spraying too big of spots. But it depends on what's going to come back into that spot. You know, like in my opinion, we talk about, you know, putting my arms out, wrapping them around. You know, there's a diameter of about 600 millimeters, and that's about how big a spot should be. So that's our team's standard approach to it. If you get too small on that spot, you're going to have too much growth up the sides, and as that growth comes up, it's going to close in over the tree. So you don't want it to be too small. If you make it too big, it's just going to be dead ground and an invitation for every weed in the world to strike back in it. So you've got to get the balance right there. But I reckon, yeah, about 600 mil is about the right size. And then the spacing totally comes down to your project. So as far apart as you're going to put the trees is how far you want to put them. Someone's actually had a really good question around Californian thistles. So California thistles are really just a visual pest for trees generally. And this is really bad infestations. They actually don't suck a lot of light and actually cover and smother a tree in the same way that that actual grass does. So there are some places where we absolutely need to control them, and we do with our release sprays anyway. But generally, they're just a visual nuisance. If you've got good densities in 3 years' time, you're going to be covering them all up. They're not going to grow in the shade, and you're going to be away. So yeah, that's a good one. Good way of looking at it. Kikuyu was a question as well. So yeah, it's a challenge with Kikuyu, where it's really thick. You know, this is where the site prep thing comes in. Is actually, you know, cattle are some of the best things in the world for preparing a planting site, you know, in there chewing up everything and getting it really, you know, like chewing through that mat in the winter when they're hungry. Dry cows and steers and just sort of, yeah, really opening up a nice sort of area to graze. Because if you don't get on top of it and knock it back, it's just so hard to come back later. So in that criteria situation, you're often going to need an extra release spray over what you would if you were just dealing with standard ryegrass. But it's also really important to get the prep done right. So yeah, no, that's a really good question. How long after you spray can trees be planted? Yeah, for most chemicals, I think the particular tube product we use is a 3-week stand down on it. But like I say, you want the spots to be showing. So, it's generally 4 to 6 weeks. But if you want to, you can actually spray glyphosate and plant straight into it, because the glyphosate's not active in the soil. It's not going to damage the plant itself. And then the grass will die around it. But practically speaking, 4 to 6 weeks generally is the way to go. Oh, that seems to be all on spraying for now. Into the next one, we'll cover some more on releasing later anyway. So plant supply and planting. So ordering plants. When do you need to order plants? So it depends a little bit on the volume of plants you're ordering and the type of species you're going to need. We would take most of our orders for the season happen in March. It's right on the cusp of planting season. Planting season generally starts sort of late April or into May. And yeah, it means that you're in ahead of the season before everything's dispatched out. In reality, it would be easier for us as a nursery to say, hey, can you please order those last spring, because we can grow the right number of things. But it's just not the reality of it. For a lot of farmers, it quietens down through this autumn period, especially when the cows go dry, and then that's when they're into planting. So just bearing in mind that as you come in towards the planting season, some species might be out of stock, they might be harder to find, you might not be able to get them in the grade you need, so you might compromise your project a little bit. Planning's always good, but because we are a for farmers nursery, we generally carry a lot more stock that you can just walk in and buy, or phone up and buy any time of the year. So planting methods. So there's a big debate around using an auger or using a spade. I'm going to cover that in a video later. And that's, again, we talk about a religious debate, whether which God is correct in that sense. But hey, again, there's no exactly right way, but everyone has their preference. The process for planting. So, yeah, we've talked about the pre-spray. So imagine you've got a spot there, cool. You're going to wait 4 to 6 weeks and then you're going to plant. Depending on the grade of plants you're using, will depend on what your process is for planting. So if you've got them all in there in bags or individual pots, well, you might actually go and lay them out by the spot, walk over to them, dig or auger the hole and then put it in. If you've got trays of plants, then what you might do is actually get all the holes dug and then go and get a collection of your trays and distribute them through the area randomly into the correct, as we talked about earlier, damp here, dry there, right species, right place. And there's no sort of single right way of doing that, but it is important that you get that distribution correct. And it's important you don't have trees lying around out of their pots or bags for too long in the hot sun. Don't leave them overnight and those sorts of things. You got to think about your logistics when you're planning your project too. How are we going to get those plants to site? We have a quad bike and trailer for for really rough areas to get into. We like to try and get utes where we can. It just lowers the cost of planting, the physical labour cost of planting. But we've had to helicopter trees into planting sites in the past as well. So working out those logistics beforehand can really determine the success of your project. It's important. Talk about plant distribution across the site, and I'll keep banging on about it as I do with all of our new trainees, is that, you don't want to have those wet species up on the side of a dry hill, and you don't want to have something that loves to dry down in the wet, because they won't thrive. It'll look silly. It won't look natural. So getting the advice on that and planning is really important. And we recommend a quality control check, especially if you're not doing it every day. Before you finish at the end of the day, have someone walk through the whole block and just check that everything's been planted. We help out with a lot of community days, and yeah, it's so common to see a pile of 5 trees just lying on the ground, or so it's important to do that quality control. Make sure the trees are potted in firmly, and a really big thing, and it's not up there as a bullet point, but don't tease the roots on the trees. And this is sort of it must be an ornamental plant thing, because Adam, I'll tease the roots out. Most species we grow hate their roots being teased like that. So especially something like Manuka, you can literally just be killing it by crushing the roots on it. So yeah, getting a well-grown tree that you can lift out of a pot then put it straight into the ground is the best thing for it. It knows what to do. Select the right tree and just put it in there, and that's generally going to be soil around it. Stamp it in firm, make sure it's not pulling out, and it'll be away. So yeah, next one is the video on auger versus spade. So let's have a watch of this, and we'll see the two sides of the debate.
G'day team, Adam here from Restore Native Plant Nursery. We're out in the field here with our auger that we use to plant our trees. And a lot of people say, hey, that's a little bit different. What about spades? What are the issues we're going to run into with an auger? Are we going to get coiling of roots in our plants when we put them in? These are common questions we get, but we've been using an auger for about 5 years now, and we find they're just simply the most efficient way to get trees in the ground. And we're also finding that the trees are bouncing back a lot quicker from planting. They're not getting the same degree of transplant shock because the auger's opening up a bigger hole. So there are a few key things you need to work with. We're using a much bigger auger than the plant itself, so you're getting that dirt around the plant as it goes in. So there's place that the roots can grow straight into. The second is it's part of a system. You look at this Kānuki down here, grown on one of our 28 cell trays, nice aggressive roots. So as soon as it goes in, that plant is looking to grow and it's got soft soil to grow into. If we were using a bag or a pot, then you might be having an issue with those being root bound or circular roots that aren't aggressively trained to go down. And that's where you could get some issue in the edge of those pots. But that said, we've drilled these into hard clay ground where we've planted really poor fertility with Manuka and Kānuka on hillsides, and we've still had excellent results with those plants just bouncing out of the ground, instant growth coming through. So look, this is our method of planting. We can get through a lot of plants. It also really suits because we've got the muscle, simple blokes like me who just roll through on the auger and get the holes done and do the hard work. And then we've got the finesse, people like Hannah on our team who come through and they make sure that plant's planted really well, it's standing up straight, and we get real good quality control because we've got two people passing that planting. So if you want really good quality planting from a team who knows what they're doing, get in touch with us at Restore Native.
I really did say that was a balance between spade and auger, didn't I? But it really wasn't a balance between spade and auger. That was just really an advertisement for planting with an auger. We do actually plant with a spade, and some of the smaller grades we will plant with a spade at times, where it's appropriate to do so, really soft ground, where access is more difficult, and then a few other things. But yeah, for our, for quality commercial product for us, we found the auger is simply the best thing. And someone says, hey, no, I want to plant with a spade. Totally, there's nothing wrong with that. Just making sure you're getting that depth and you're freeing up enough soil around the plant itself. That's the really important thing. In situations where you're just making a cut and you're forcing hard ground into a plant, you can get some issues with sort of transplant shock. It doesn't mean the tree's going to die, but it's not going to thrive quite the same way. So I've got a few more questions here around Kikuyu and a couple of pre-plant things, but we'll come back to them at the end, I think, because I'll just get through these through the rest of it and rather than hold everyone up, but we'll have a chat at the end. FERT tabs, I'll just answer that while we're flicking through the next thing. Do we use fertilizer tabs? We generally don't. And it's because, an aggressive tree well planted is going to grow well. A FERT tab will give you some extra growth. So there are times when people are really like, hey, we want these to rocket, for a certain reason. They're a bit more of an ornamental planting or, there are tons of reasons why that can be useful. I reckon maybe 5 to 10% of our total plantings we would put a FERT tab in. But it comes down to economics. If a FERT tab around 20-25 cents if you want to put a good one in. We've seen, we don't tend to use a pressed FERT tab anymore. We use a proper Osmocote FERT tab that's going to genuinely break down over time. We've seen those pressed FERT tabs disappear in a month or two, or still be there in the soil in a year's time. We try and use a really good quality FERT tab, and it does cost a little bit of money. Generally not worth it, but definitely in some cases it certainly is. So it's a very political answer. I'm starting to sound like Winston Peters, but anyway, spring release. I think that's the most important thing you can do. Look after your plant. The timing of this is critical. And I had a question earlier about what better sprays can we use? Honestly, the timing of the release spray is one of the most important things, and it really depends on the season. We've had these really wet summers, and we've actually been having to do 2 releases in that first summer for a lot of plants because the grasses kept growing into January. But the releasing is, I think, one of the biggest areas people fall down because often those plants need a release at a time of year when everything else is happening on the farm. You know, you're making silage, you're mating, you're doing ground for maize or whatever it is. If you miss that window by a couple of weeks, all of your plants can be covered in grass. And at that point, you might have lost 20% of them. It becomes 5 times harder to go and release them at that point. So timing's critical. For anyone who's on this call who's a client of ours, you know, what we do is in September, we'll visit most of our sites. We'll then get in communication with the landowner, and we have joint responsibility on that then, where we'll be sharing photos to and fro, going, hey, yep, you know, the plants need releasing now or whatnot. So as you can see in this photo example here, there's an Akiaki, he's only a small one, the grass is starting to climb up around him. That's the time to spray it. You can still see the plant. There's still enough around it where you can sort of kill that vegetation off to stop it climbing over. That vegetation then lays down as a mat, and that tree's good for the spring then. It might need another release in that sort of midsummer time, depending on the season. But if you time that release so that the plant isn't covered, but also you're not just spraying bare ground, if you can get a little bit of grass up, lay that down, absolute perfect for releasing. So we generally release spray once in a spring. Maybe like in the last couple of years, you know, a third of our sites have needed a second release in that first spring. In most cases, that's enough then to get them up where they're sort of, you know, hip height by the next spring, or a little bit taller, and therefore they're not in danger of the grass anymore. So yeah, timing is critical with that release spray. We'll show you a video on how to release spray. Now, obviously, there's some aversion to chemicals. Some people say, "Oh no, we'll hand release it." Well, we kind of do a little bit of both. So we'll remove the vegetation from around the tree, and we'll spray it. Because if you just push the vegetation down, it can be growing back up again, especially in that springtime. So that's important. I'll talk about it a bit more in this video here, in terms of a little bit of a how-to with releasing, and then we'll come back to the next part.
G'day team, Adam here from Restore Native. Today just running a little bit of a tutorial on how to release spray a tree. So what we're doing, we're out here looking at a tree that was planted this winter. It's had a pre-spray around it before we planted, so that the weeds and grass coming back aren't too prolific. Now's a pretty good time to be getting in and giving this a release. We're in the middle of spring, and this stuff here, now that it's established, is going to be growing up, and we don't want it to come in and cover over top of this tree. So what we're going to do today is just give that a little bit of a spray around, and I've got Gerard here who's going to give it a bit of a spray for me, and just show you how we're going to arc around that tree and basically spray the grass and the weeds just around in that sort of 500 millimeter arc around the tree. And then now, just like that, it's all protected. All this grass is going to die down here, and that tree's not going to get swamped as we come into late summer, which could eventually drag it down, rob its light, and basically kill it in the ground. So this is why releasing is important. And this is a really good time of year to get in and release it before it's totally covered with grass.
Yeah, again, on our YouTube, there's, I think, sort of 3 or 4 videos about releasing, all worth watching, just to sort of understand the impacts that they can have. You know, certain trees just need a little bit more than others. And yeah, but it's just such an important thing removing that competition. I've got a couple of questions here I'll just cover off. Yeah, so problems with keeping the grass down around those plantings, the spot spray, and that really comes back to the timing thing. So spot spray with tag or with turb is going to mean that, you know, you're not going to get swamped by grass in that first flush of spring in September, but you're still going to have to get in and release it, and it just depends on the timing. There's no kind of silver bullet for that. So what's the most efficient and effective way to control grass? It's actually glyphosate, and it's timing. So we do occasionally release with non-glyphosate. So in things like really woody stem things, Manuka and Carnica, where you've got a monoculture of those, you can actually spray over the top of them with haloxyflop. Galant would be a chemical name. And there are some other trees which are actually tolerant to being sprayed more or less right over top with that as well, so you don't have to be quite as careful. But that's not everything, so you have to be quite careful. That'll kill cabbages, it'll kill hebes, it kills other things. So you can't just sort of blanket use that and just think it's okay. It also only kills grass. So glyphosate's great because it's broad spectrum, you know, it'll kill weeds. It it'll kill grass, it'll kill small brush weeds coming back. So we tend to, we train our team. It's like using a scalpel, not a flamethrower. You can't just go out there and kill all that. It's really that, like we do, as you saw Gerard in the video, around the tree, we stamp down the bit of grass away from the tree, we spray that nice and gently. And that is really the most efficient way to do it. Sedges are another one that you can actually spray aloxiflop and brush killer over top of, depending on the weeds that you're trying to control. But 95% of the time, it'll be glyphosate's the best way to go. Timing and accuracy is key. So there's no sort of silver bullet. I really, really wish there was. I really wish there was. Anyway, on to the next one. Enrichment planting, follow-up, weed control, releases and checks. Cool. So this is kind of, at the end of your process. So once you've got canopy established, your trees are a couple of years old, they're not really in danger of dropping dead at that point. They're not getting swamped by grass. And then it's the opportunity to come in and actually enrich that planting, put those extra species in, put those Remu that you love, the Miro, those harder to grow species. They're also going to be more expensive species because they're harder to grow in a nursery. But you don't need 1,000 of them. You don't need a high percentage of your total planting of those trees. You can just sort of get those in there when they've got that shade and shelter. They'll outlive, the shrubs of the pittosporums and the manukas and the like, and come through. So it's working out which trees. What do you want that to look like in 200 years' time? It's what trees are going to grow well in your area, and that's where that eco-sourcing thing comes in a bit more too. And then sort of going, how many trees will you need? Well, are you just going to go through and plant some spots? You're never going to get 100% survival in your planting. A lot of the contracts will have. Will state 80%. Well, we're sort of aiming for 90, and it depends on the season. We've had a drier summer this summer. Some of the drier sites have struggled, and they're around that 90% range. But some damper sites have done fantastic in a year like this, and they're near on 100%. So they're a natural living thing. They're like livestock. Not all of them are going to stay alive. There's going to be an opportunity then in the odd spot where a tree isn't there to go and drop an enrichment tree in. So it's a really cool opportunity to put your bit of flair onto these areas. And I really encourage people not to just plant an area and stand on the outside of it. You want to create like an area you're proud of that you want to get in and involved. If you're planting a hillside, leave a track through it or something where you can actually go through and enjoy it. And the more you do that, the more you get to engage with nature, and the more you actually really appreciate the other benefits those trees are bringing to your farm. And it becomes that sort of amenity value as well. So that's important. That's enrichment planting, looking at the trees and whatnot. Weed incursions. So especially in those first few years where there's still sort of open grass and you don't have a canopy, weed incursions are a big problem. It's so much easier to whip through in that first summer and spray the odd blackberry here or there, or the odd bit of a climbing weed, convolvulus or something like that, than it is to wait 2 or 3 summers and notice that it's taken over sort of a quarter of your planting block, because the chemical options just aren't there in the same way. So it is worth that sort of summer follow-up, and it seems like throwing a bit of more money into something when you've already planted the trees. But if you can just target those things when they're small, you've got so many more options to sort of keep on top of them. Pest pressure. So that's the other thing too. If depending on your area, I actually had a question here from somewhere, was about rabbits. How do we deal with rabbits? So that's an interesting one actually, which probably includes in some of the planting. There is actually a product called Plant Skid that you can spray over the plants before they're planted or when they're planted to deter rabbits. It's not 100% effective. We find that really in that winter period, they're most hungry. That's when you get a lot of damage on plants, and that pest pressure tends to be less of an issue as you go over time. It's really only goats and deer that are impacting tree survival a little bit later. But we definitely recommend, spotlighting that sort of control through that first winter. And then once it gets to spring, the trees are putting enough growth on, they're less impacted by the likes of rabbits and hares. But it's a really good point. And then you're looking at sort of, you're creating a forest. So rats, possums, mustelids, all the things that want to move in with the birds and eat them and eat all your nice berries and fruit that you're producing in there. So over time, you may choose to sort of take on, some possum control or some rat control and really try and, work with the birds to do something magic in there. And that again depends on your site, what those pests are and whatnot. So, but yeah, just identifying with every site being a little bit different and every challenge being a little bit different. Sorry, I'm just going to have a drink. We can move on to the next thing. Here we are at the end. So there's a QR code there. If you've got this on your computer, you can scan that. I'm told if you're on your phone, you can take a screenshot and you can look through it later. Anyway, you can jump onto our website, which is just restorenative.co.nz, and click the FAQs button. There's a heap of sort of handy videos on there which answer a lot of the stuff we've talked about tonight. And I think by the look of some of the amazing questions we've had, I'll also have a few more going up over the next few weeks to record and answer. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I've got about 10 questions in front of me. So what I'll do is I'll hang around for a little bit and I will answer those questions. For everyone who's registered for this, I'll actually email out the slides. So this will go out to everyone. You can basically watch that, which is no trouble at all. And just keep in touch. I'm Adam at restorenative.co.nz. Just send me an email. Nothing's a problem. I love chatting trees. So yeah, we'll roll through. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you coming. I actually am bloody blown away by how many people we had register and jump on. So I really appreciate that. And hopefully there's a little bit of knowledge there which helps everyone. So on to the Q&A stuff. I'll get through these. Where are we? Cool. What are good plants for north-facing clay banks that have rainwater runoff across the surface and struggles to sink in over summer? Sounds very landscapey and the type of thing we have around cowsheds at times too. Most likely going to be a good fit there is going to be a carex grass planted relatively densely. They soak up water really well. They clump out, so they actually, they can disturb the flow of water quite well. And yeah, densely planting them and those sorts of areas generally tends to be the best way to approach it. That said, send me an email with a photo. Happy to have a look at it and give you a bit more specific advice. But we also use those sort of around key catchment areas around tracks and, where water's running down off tracks and potentially into streams. We'll put in, a bunch of carex grasses because they soak up that nutrient and sediment. They stop the water flow to drop the sediment out of it and soak up a lot of nutrient. So, yeah, they're a really good option for that. Is there a minimum size required for funding? Yeah, there is for certain funders. Depending on the catchment you're in, depending on which funder, they might fund as little as sort of a quarter of a hectare. But then there are other ones like the WRA and whatnot that can actually, I think they're a minimum 3 hectares. So yeah, it depends a little bit on the funder. But often your council will want to support projects no matter the size, but it depends whether you're a priority catchment or not. But yeah, good question worth asking, and one we can obviously help with more specifically if you wish. Do we upsize the pot as the tree grows or plant from seed into a bigger pot? Yeah, really good question. Jump on to our YouTube and have a look at some of our seed germination. So we've got a semi-automated system out of Italy in our nursery. We use an air seeder to seed into trays of 300. We then use various methods of transplant, where we then transplant into different trays and pot sizes. And then if we're keeping plants for sort of 3-4 years, we will actually take them up to a larger size. So we start from little teeny things from a seed and they go to this big and get potted. And then they might go to that big and get potted again. And then if they're that big, they get potted again. So yeah, we actually pot up as we go. And it's partly a size efficiency and continue sort of grading them as well. But yeah, every nursery's got a little bit different there. Would we ignite Kokuya rather than round up through existing natives around extending the area? Ignite might be a spray product. Sorry, I might completely miss that one. I might have a quick Google on that because it might be a name of a product that has an active that we don't use. We'll check that. Sorry, and whoever that is, I might see if I can come back to you on that because it might just be a chemical name. What about land that hasn't been retired where grazing not an option and grass is long? Yeah, so in those situations, we will often wind up just spraying twice in a winter. So we'll get in there and we'll spray early in the autumn, let the grass sort of, die down a bit, and then we'll come back and we'll tidy up any hotspot grass areas and just let that grass actually rot down rather than sort of forming a thatch. And that sort of really thatchy grass, a lot of bugs and stuff will often live and can actually give the plants a hard time when they go in, certain species more than others. So yeah, we actually find that just, timing is key on that. So does work. And often, it'll wind up being a double spray to make those sort of rank grass areas work well, just to get them to rot down in simple terms. Oh, I love this one. Should I keep gorse as a nursery crop? Now, I love Hugh Wilson and the Honeywye guys down on Banks Peninsula. Look, the reality is gorse will act as a nursery crop. If you look at Honeywye, we're 2025. They started in about 1990. Now, I was there about 18 months ago. There's still a lot of gorse there. There's also some awesome regenerating natives, but that's 35 years. How long do you want to look at gorse for? It will eventually revert to native. If you've got the seed bank in the area or you've planted trees in there, it will eventually revert to native. But how long do you want to look at gorse for? I was just on site with a client today in an area that was ex-pines. We planted about 18 months ago. And unfortunately, the gorse has just come back like thick as anything. And it's probably just gotten a bit far now that we've seen it. There's actually areas that we're actually just going to go and blanket spray that gorse. It's going to kill some of the native trees that are under it. But otherwise, the gorse is spreading through the whole area. So we're going to sacrifice about 200 or 300 trees, kill the gorse, clean that side up, leave it another summer, get two summers worth of sprays on it, and then replant into those areas. Because otherwise he's like, oh, I don't want to be driving down my driveway staring at gorse every day. So it will go, but it just takes time. Do you need to water the freshly planted trees? You really don't in most cases. So it's about the planting season. And this is another thing that people can get a bit hung up on dates. The planting season is really, as soon as it's permanently damp in the autumn, is a good time to start planting. You don't want to plant after the first autumn rain and then it dries out for another 2 weeks and then your plants are under a bunch of heat and water stress. Wait until it's permanently damp in the autumn. Last year we were planting in the middle of March. This year it might be after Anzac weekend before we're planting, and it'll just depend on when those autumn rains come. So generally there's enough moisture then in the ground that you don't need to water them. Don't need to worry about it. Preventing pukeko pulling out trees. Send me an email. I'll send you something. We had some really crafty clients who built these little metal shrouds to go around their trees. Pukekos are funny. Pukekos on our farm don't pull out trees, but some pukekos are just terrible at it. So, yeah, we've tried various ways, depending on the species. Often it's wetland stuff, right? So flaxes and grasses. We've used wire, like a wire stake, down over top of it. So, yeah, it makes it harder for them to yank out. We have used bigger grade trees. They still manage to yank them out in some cases. Things like cabbage trees, they can just chew the top down on them and decimate them completely. Where possible, again, it's probably one of the best things for doing that. But there are a number of solutions. But yeah, I've seen some really big problems with that. What size auger for a 28 cell? That's a good one. We use 100 mils for a 28 cell. It's got a collar on it, which I think is about 70 mils, 75 mils. And yeah, using 100 mil provides enough sort of loose dirt around it that when you sort of, heel that in, it's going to pack that in, but there's enough loose stuff there for it to grow into. 125 is even better. But yeah, we do use 100 mil for that. Do you think it would work to plant out the longer term species and a 10 to 15-year-old Kānuka monocrop? Yeah, absolutely. Totally. Kānuka especially, because Kānuka forms a trunk and obviously a big tall tree. So it's not just sort of stealing all the light like Mānuka can. We were actually involved in a project last year where that actually ended up cutting sways through this densely planted manuka that was planted way too close together, less than a metre in a lot of areas, to create a bit of light, to put some kakatea in to actually create that. But under Kānuka at that size, absolutely perfect, and a really good, like if it's not regenerating under there now, birds have got no reason to go to Kānuka. It's not a not going there to feed on fruit, so they're generally not carrying seeds in there in the same way they would be with fruiting plants. So if you're not getting the regeneration, you can kick it off by getting some fruiting species in and some longer term species. That's a really good option. Opinion on tree guards? Yeah, they really have their place, and like we don't tend to use them very much at all in the Waikato. But it's because the cost of them is often higher than the loss from not having them. But if you've got an area where, again, the pukekos, for example, you've got real bad rabbit hair infestation, you can't control it through normal methods, tree guards, yeah, really good option. But yeah, it just comes down to, where are you going to spend your money on a project? If you're planting 1,000 trees and, you got to buy 1,000 tree guards, it's going to cost you $2,000. But perhaps you could have bought another 500 trees for that price. You might be better off with the trees. So it depends on the site. In really harsh conditions, if you want the trees to look really good or to establish faster, they can really help. They have their place. If I lived in the South Island, almost definitely tree guards, but yeah, in the Waikato, a little bit different. Native registered in the ETS, is it worth it? Yeah, that's a great question. I've got about 30 odd hectares of native planting on my farm, not registered in the ETS currently. As it stands, you basically get for native in the ETS, you get 6.5 tonnes a hectare on the lookup tables. It's not really fair. They call it regenerating scrub. Tane's Tree Trust, look them up. They're awesome. They've done some research on the long-term sequestration of natives. That science is starting to gain a little bit more traction, but still not super viable. That said, we've got clients who have planted manuka with tōtara. They will be putting that into the ETS. They'll be getting it assessed and be able to claim higher in the carbon credits because of that. It's a science a little bit above my head, and because it's all a little bit out there in the ether. There's also changes they're talking around biodiversity credits, so potentially incentivizing farmers by providing biodiversity credits as a way to sort of soften the blow into the ETS. Yeah, but at this stage, it's become a real political football, and it's a real shame because I think there should be more of an angle there to do that. But at the moment, it's marginal. So carbon crop, good people to talk to about that. They know a little bit more on that stuff. What plants are good in and around ponds? A great yarn this morning with a guy who's planting a duck pond. And yeah, it depends exactly how you want it to look. But ideally, on the edge of a pond, you would have a naturally occurring wetland pond. You'd have the likes of carex grasses, or you'd have some reeds in the water. A lot of people won't plant reeds themselves, but they will plant the carex grasses, sedges, and that next phase up right on the water's edge. And then beyond that, you're going to have things like toys and flaxes, cabbage trees. And then as you get out a little bit further from that, you've got ribbonwoods and kakateas and those sorts of things. So it's a little bit like the graphic that we showed earlier around where things go. It depends on the look you want. Carex grasses are actually fantastic things. They're a sedge, but yeah, for around, water quality, creating habitat, they're actually fantastic. But yeah, I can help you with a bit more advice on that one if you like. Do you get much of this original seed bed coming back from native even years after grazing? Ferns seem to come back after 5 years. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I see this on my farm. I've got a really infertile paddock up the back by a bunch of bush, and bracken comes back through it as well. So yeah, it's amazing that sort of, that bracken fern, the rhizome through. A lot of the other ferns, if it's ungrazed, because they are actually just spores floating around, they'll actually come through and establish quite well over time, but less so actual hard seeds. You've got to have, normally a bird will carry that seed, it's got to have a reason to sit there and poop a relatively fresh seed out. Excuse me. So yeah, it doesn't happen. You know, you're not going to get Remu popping up in the middle of a paddock, but you will get likes of ferns. Excuse me, my voice is going off a little bit. Are there any rules around harvesting native trees? Yeah, so that's actually really cool. Hane's Tree Trust, again, a guy called Ian Brennan, who I'm actually fortunate to say is my neighbour, is doing exactly that. So you have to have a sustainable forest management plan, which is interesting. Bit of a process there, but definitely can be done. So yeah, look up Tane's Tree Trust. I think that's a great idea. So yeah, they've got all the information you want on that. Bear with me, I'm just going to have a little bit of a cough. Okay. One more here. What I recommend what would I recommend for planting a narrow riparian strip with only enough width for one tree? Would there be anything special for maintenance? Cool. Great. Yeah, cool. So yeah, we actually looked at a site up in North Waikato earlier this week, which is exactly that. It's kind of classic dairy farm and it's relatively close in on a sort of it's not really a drain, it's just sort of a wet area. Little bit of running water down the middle. Now, I don't think there's any point trying to establish a forest there. You know, a forest needs a bit of support around it. You need to ideally have 3 trees deep if you want to establish an actual bush. So in an area like that, or if it's relatively close around a drain, we're going back to sedges and grasses because they will actually act as really good nutrient filters. You know, sediment filters, they'll cover the water in there. They'll actually increase that biodiversity and make the water healthier. But yeah, very hard to actually establish much there. You can plant the odd cabbage tree or a ribbonwood, grow quite upright. But yeah, you can't really, no point planting a manuka and a thing, you know, they're not going to establish as a hedge in a really tidy way like they would if they were well looked after. But, you know, just being sympathetic to the area. And I think in this particular situation that we saw up in North Waikato, Carrick's grasses were a great option for it. So, yeah. Okay. That is us through the Q&A. I'm being told to mention that I'm actually writing a book. We are writing a book, so expect a book released sometime this autumn. And really, like I say, my motivation is just around breaking down barriers for people to get out and do this amazing work. It's your land, it's your projects you're passionate about, and we are merely just a part of that, and we just want to help do that. So, so yeah, we're here to share our sort of learning as we've sort of gone along, and more than happy to help. Like I say, send me an email, Adam at Restore Native. Always keen to have a yarn about trees. So, very good, team. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Really appreciate you putting up with me. We'll catch you again, hopefully somewhere along the line. Keep up the great work.